Thank you everyone for coming along today. As Mike said, I'm just going to, actually before I do that, let me just check I can show my slideshow properly. Why doesn't it want to work? There we go, from the beginning. So everyone should be able to see that, hopefully. If please someone shout if you can't. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm Jamie Robbins. I'm projects manager at Buglife. So I'm going to talk to you mainly today about beelines, as was hopefully clear from the beginning. But I thought I'd better start by saying who Buglife are, because we're an organisation that lots of people may not be familiar with. So as Mike says, we're the Invertebrate Conservation Trust. We're the only organisation in Europe devoted to the conservation of all invertebrates. So for a small organisation, and we're about 25 people across all of the UK, we've got a rather big job on our hands with about 37,000 invertebrates to try and deal with. So we do everything from delivering projects which might be on coal spoils, delivering wildflowers, protecting bogs, to brownfields, wherever they might be. We also do lots of planning and policy influencing. At the moment, we've got a campaign to try and draw attention to light pollution, but you might have seen us associated over the years with lots of campaigns against pesticide use. We also do engagement outreach. So there's a huge chunk of work that we do as an organisation for a lot of species across a lot of habitats. So in terms of today, then, I'm going to talk about beelines, insect superhighways. So this is pretty much the run through for the session. I'll talk about what the problem is, introduce you to the concept of beelines, how we mapped them, and importantly, how you take a map and try and make it happen on the ground, because we're all familiar with seeing loads of ambitious maps, but what we need to do is turn those maps into actual flowers in actual fields on the ground. And then at the end is when we'll kind of bring it localized to try and talk about Swaledale a bit, because there is a beeline that travels right up the Swaledale. Some of it will touch on projects that you'll probably all know much more about than me, because it's looking at the kind of past, present and future approach. So there'll be some very familiar themes probably for some of you. I'm going to see if I can get this to work. If not, I will quickly leave and share another screen with you. It's not wanting to work. Oh, it worked when I did this before. So I'm going to stop sharing that and share another screen in a really professional manner. I've just shared the same one again. So this is a video that we developed, we funded for beelines. You should, actually I need to do that again because I realised I didn't check the all-important share audio box. But at least learning from mistakes, even if I'm not completely fluid. But this is a video we created for the launch of a beelines report earlier in the year, trying to engage people in beelines. This is a real high-level, simple version of beelines for you. So please do say if you can't hear it.
We all see wildflowers as beautiful and great for our well-being, but for the thousands of pollinating insects that share this land with us, wildflowers are vital. But there's a problem. Pollinators are finding themselves in isolated oases, walled in by agricultural land, urban landscapes, roads and gardens. What humans see as neat and tidy, insects see as desert. Since 1940, we've lost 97% of our flower-rich meadows, and hundreds of our pollinator species are in decline. At Buglife, we have come up with a beautiful solution to the problem. Beelines, a network of insect pathways along which we are restoring and creating wildflower-rich habitat. These insect superhighways will extend across the whole of the UK, allowing wildlife to move freely through our countryside and towns. But we need your help to make it happen. Restoring fields of wildflowers. Making space for wildlife in our towns, on road verges, local parks or gardens. Mowing the lawn less often. It's the easiest thing you can do for your local pollinators. Or how about planting a wildflower meadow in your local park or school? Then add your project to the Beelines map. Help us make our network of habitats bigger, better and more joined up. Find out more at buglife.org.uk. Saving the small things that run the planet.
So hopefully that gave you a bit of a flavour of what I'm going to talk about. The rest of this talk, I'm afraid, isn't quite as engaging as that animation. You guys. So there's something else. There we go. That was a very distracting moment for me. But there we go. So that's the beelines presentation we put out earlier this year. So that partly goes to show all of everything we're trying to achieve with beelines is all become clear with this presentation, but we're trying to make something that everyone can contribute to here. So in terms of why we need beeline, what the problem is, I'm going to try not to stay too negative. But you know, we know that all of our species are that a lot of our UK species, are in decline. The State of Nature report, which was led by the RSPB but was delivered by a whole coalition of wildlife NGOs, showed that 60% of UK species are in decline nationally. That's an enormous problem for us to face. A lot of the issues are very familiar, and a lot of them will overlap with a lot of the discussions that are inevitably going on with your more climate-focused workshop discussions. So this isn't just a British problem. It's important to highlight that. We know we're in a very carbon producing and nature deprived part of the world. We rank one of the worst in Europe for amounts of area of nature rich habitat retained. But it's not just the UK. In 2017, there was a study from German nature reserves, not just the wider landscape, but nature reserves, that showed a 75% in flying insect abundance over 25 years. And if that's happening within nature reserves, it's impossible to imagine what's happening across that wider countryside. And at this point, I should make a very clear point, is that pollinators are more than just bees. When you say pollinators, not only do people think of bees, there's a real tendency to focus on honeybees, which are just one of our 280 odd bee pollinators. We're talking moths, butterflies, wasps, beetles, and you know, two-thirds of our moths and 71% of our butterflies are in long-term decline. They keep finding year on year more and more statistics that are just more and more depressing about the declines going on with invertebrates. And a very unswaled-tail example here, but down in South Devon, we have the six-banded nomad bee, Nemada sexfasciata, which is now only found on a single site, a single stretch of coastline and wildflower-rich grassland. This is just one example of species who their ranges are contracting because of the lack of habitat until there's virtually nowhere left for them to go. So we're genuinely at risk here of losing native species. And how did we get here? A lot of this, I'm trying to link in the carbon stuff as you go through to try and make it climate appropriate. But we know as emissions have gone up, a lot of that goes alongside the intensification of agriculture, whether it's the production of fertilizers and pesticides, the release of soil from carbon from over intensively managing them. But since the 50s, we've lost a huge amount of our wildflower rich habitat. They're becoming more nutrient rich, which is less favorable to pollinators, are being overcut, generally basically mowing wildflowers out of existence. As field sizes have been increased and we've had a more machine oriented nature of farming, we're losing the fine scale patchwork of a lot of our farming. And in addition to that, there's this plain disruption of flower rich grass for overseeding, for inverted commas, improving, for grazing. And what's happening is that the few remaining areas of wildflower rich habitat are becoming more and more fragmented. And I was going to say this is less Swaledale relevant, this background here, but I think it still is, because it all links up, it's all connected. Before I moved up to Richmond a year ago, before then I lived in South Lincolnshire. This slide in the background here, that brown big expanse of bare mud, is what I had to deal with on a daily basis throughout much of the year. This is what our wildlife faces with modern agricultural practices for much of the year. What was 3 million hectares of wildflower rich grassland is now cropland or green desert grazing land with grass but very little flower for pollinators. And there are things that are happening. Yes, there are agri-environment schemes. We point towards them as being little saviours for wildlife here and there. But the statistics show that only 10,000 hectares of habitat suitable for invertebrates has been created through these schemes. That's 0.3% of what has been lost. So it really is tinkering at the edges here. We're dealing with habitats being lost, being more fragmented and less connected. So we're lacking this core habitat resource for our pollinators. And on top of that, I mentioned the 10,000 hectares of agri-environment scheme delivery. A lot of that is untargeted, and the word we use is diffuse for that delivery. If you've got a map of the UK, it's literally depending on where you have a sympathetic farmer crop up. There's not very much uptake of the best wildflower-rich options as well. What we need is permanent cover. When you move out into arable landscapes, you'll often find they have these annual nectar mixes around the edges to kind of provide some temporary forage for pollinators. These annual margins produce only a fraction of the nectar and pollen that established perennial grasslands do. We need to bring back our permanent habitats. And again, falling in line with the Lawton review, we need that bigger, better, and more joined up approach to wildlife conservation. And it really is important for pollinators. Many of our pollinators live in meta-population type situations, which, to make it less technical, means they live in a landscape of populations. And if a population is lost from a site, that's fine, because they can be recolonized by another population from an adjacent site. But as all those sites are disappearing, our invertebrates are having nowhere to go. And when the environmental conditions on those few remaining sites fall out of condition, they just disappear. So we need to bring back that permanent habitat to help connect them and to make it easier for them to move across the landscape. We need the landscape to be permeable to create these corridors for them, which is where beelines comes in, quite neatly for me. So what beelines are is a network of 3-kilometre corridors that are connecting the best remaining areas for wildflower-rich habitat. We're not daft. I mentioned at the beginning that we're an organisation of about 25 people. So this isn't something we think that we can swoop in and deliver. We're not going to alone be able to fill that map you can see on the right-hand side there with wildflowers. It is very much a shared endeavour, and that's something that's underpinned beelines, and we'll talk about again in a while. It's a prioritised network for everyone to focus their wildflower delivery. I mentioned a few slides ago that delivery tends to be quite diffuse and random on a map. That's an incredibly inefficient way of doing it. We know that our pollinators are not just trying to move between existing habitats, they're trying to move in response to climate change and a changing environment as well. We need it to be direct to help them to be able to move across landscapes and move between habitats. And the way this was mapped, I'll talk about shortly, but it's a data-led approach which has been guided by local expertise and knowledge. For those of you more involved with wildlife, I won't go on about it too long in terms of the policy. You might be hearing a lot about local nature recovery strategies at the moment, which is the government's latest approach to how they're going to, bring back the nature that's been declining. And this follows a similar model to that, in that it's a national network that's been mapped at that local level and using local knowledge. And it's something everyone can contribute to. And I'll come back to this map several times. This is the one very technical part of my presentation, so do bear with me. And I know it's quite hard to see the slide, but it just backs up the beelines approach. So this is a very, very technical project done by the University of Liverpool, looking at what happens if you have a set number of blocks of habitat and how species can adapt to climate change if they're arranged differently. So the bottom left there has all of those blocks in 2 big lumps near each other. Unsurprisingly, it's very difficult for those wildlife that rely on those habitats to move anywhere but between those 2 blocks. Clockwise, going up towards the top left, you'll see what's actually a quite realistic example of habitats across the landscape. Little bits here, bigger bits here, quite evenly distributed randomly distributed, but with blocks all over the place. And if you look at that graph there, the conductivity and speed of range expansion, what you want things to be at the top right of that graph. And that example doesn't allow, there's not a lot of option for them to move between sites, because although there's lots of sites, they quickly go extinct in those little sites. And that's kind of where a lot of our wildlife is now. The best example to be able to move, say, from north to south or east to west, this is all in a world of computer modeling, so it involves idealistic approaches as well. That top right example looks like a crosshair. So the top example that looks like a crosshair is in theory the one that has the most conductivity, so it helps species move. But that top right example, which you can see you can probably faintly see some linear features, is exactly what beelines are. It's stepping stones of habitat within a corridor. And that's what we're trying to achieve. So when you say beelines, people assume you must be trying to make a continuous stretch of wildflowers from one coast to another. We're actually not. What we've got here are corridors with patches and stepping stones of habitat. So I'll move on from that rather boring modelling approach. So yeah, what we need is something that can allow to have sustainable populations on key wildlife sites and help them move between that in a channel pattern. That's stepping stones of habitat within a corridor, as I mentioned. So beelines have a number of underlying principles. I'll go into the more interesting parts in a moment. This is an important part to help understand what they're doing. So they're east-west and north-south corridors, essentially. We want species to be able to move across that landscape. And we want a continuous network of habitat. That's the important word in that, is network, which is another word for those stepping stones of habitat. And it's very important we emphasize that, because otherwise people get carried away by thinking it's all arable field margins and hedgerows and linear features. And what we're doing is we're connecting the best remaining wildflower-rich habitats with a real focus on grasslands. But the important thing is that it's also not just pollinators. If you imagine a landscape of connected wildflower-rich habitats and hedgerows and scrubland, that's something that's going to benefit a whole host of species groups beyond just pollinators. So although Buglife mapped it predominantly for bees, there are gains to be made for birds, for reptiles, for all species groups within that. And one last technical slide about the approach and the principles. I mentioned that species go extinct on small sites quite easily. We know that to really support good pollinator populations, you need big patches of land. Ideally, you want 2-hectare patches. So what we want to be the real backbone of this beelines network is whole field 2-hectare scale reversion. And our ambition within those corridors of beelines that you saw is for 10% of that 10% of that corridor to be made wildflower-rich habitats. So this is an example from Kent on the south coast. You can see beelines is it's actually incorporating a whole range of habitats. If you've ever looked at this sort of mapping projects before, they tend to zone in on particular habitat types. But as I'll explain, what we do here is we just lump together in a cleverer fashion than that, I promise you, all habitats that are actually valuable for pollinators. So within this map here, you can see there's urban areas, there's vegetated shingle at the bottom there, it's Dungeness. There's deciduous woodland, there's rolling grasslands, there's a whole host of coastal habitats that make up that beeline. So in terms of how we map them, this is from a workshop I did in Norfolk, Suffolk, probably about 6 years ago now. This used to be how we did it. We'd literally have our maps and we would get experts in a room and we'd thrash it out. Unsurprisingly, in COVID times, we've moved a bit more online now. But in terms of that beelines network, it first started being mapped 10 years ago up in the Yorkshire area, thanks to some funding we had from the cooperative. And it's been done in a piecemeal fashion as and when funding has become available. So about two years ago, we finished the mapping for Wales. Last year, we finished Scotland. And this year, virtually 2 months off 10 years, the anniversary when we first started doing beelines up in Yorkshire, we finally finished the whole England map.
Wow.
So the way we do it is it's based on data principally. Data and local expertise is where it all works. So to map beelines, we had to get data. We had to use a national panel of experts to help us identify what habitats are important for pollinators, identify those networks, and then do a whole process of consultation. So it does get more interesting, this, I promise you, just bear with me while we get through a technical bit and then we talk about making things happen on the ground. But this is all a part of understanding why beelines work. So for mapping beelines, we had a group of experts who identified on the list of all the UK habitats which ones we thought were key and which were beneficial for invertebrates, for pollinators. So we've got key habitats, which many of which will be very un-Richmondshire appropriate, such as maritime, cliff and slope. But we've got lots of important grassland habitats that are identified as key there, but also semi-natural woodlands and coastal floodplain grazing marsh are in there as beneficial, along with good quality semi-improved grassland. In a world where wildflower-rich grasslands have been so obliterated, we have to include good quality semi-improved clover-rich grasslands in this as well. So we tried to be pragmatic with this whole project. So what we did is we then merged all of them. We identified all these key and beneficial habitats from national and local data sets, and then we put a buffer around them depending on their status. So the theory, the triple SI network, the sites of special scientific interest for the UK, should be our most important habitats. They should be our most valuable habitats. So those were buffered if they've got key habitats and buffered if they've got beneficial habitats. To different degrees of buffer. I'm not going to bother going into the detail, but just so you know, we considered them to be so good that we added a buffer, assuming there'd be some sort of habitat overspill or species overspill, even though that is not always the case. And we also removed all polygons under 2 hectares from this map. You'll recall I said that for pollinators, bigger is very much better. So we want all of our sites to be over 2 hectares within this core habitat map. So another colourful looking and confusing map for you guys. In addition to picking out habitats, we have to think how pollinators use the landscape. So this here is a resistance layer, which we put behind that habitat map that effectively has a score associated for how easily each habitat we live in, how easy it is for pollinators to move across. So if you've got open water, a big area of open water will be considered very resistant to pollinators because oddly enough, a bumblebee is going to try and avoid flying over the water as part of its commute because it's not flower rich. So it's what this linkage mapper software does. It brings these two together. We use software from the University of Washington called Linkage Mapper that helps us to identify the best connective routes for pollinators based on that habitat layer and how easy it is to move through that resistance layer I just showed. And there's red lines there are the highest ranking or the best connections for pollinators moving between habitat blocks. That's the last time. This is the last slide you will see of anything this ridiculously complicated, I promise you. So this here is when we did the analysis for Devon last year. And you can see there we've got the different habitat qualities in green and yellow and the buffers. But the important bit here are those red connections. And you can see there's a whole host of connections between them. So this is where we reach the limits of how data can be useful. And this is when we ran workshops. So for each county in England and for regions in Scotland, and again for Wales and for Northern Ireland as well, we mapped networks using local knowledge and local people interpreting those maps that I've shown you. Data's fantastic, but it's only ever as good as the information available to you. And local people, again, like yourselves in this context, know the habitats, know the opportunities, know the threats, and know how to the best way to achieve what we're trying to do. And it helps create a shared ownership of the network. So we had Natural England, Forestry England at times, local authorities, local naturalists, wildlife trusts, RSPB, local park groups, all feed into these mapping on a county by county basis to look at those maps and work out what the best beeline should be for each county. And we did that piece by piece over 10 years and created this map for the UK. So it's a big undertaking, and that's just the first step. That's fun. That's wonderful. You've got a map. The world is full of well-intentioned maps. What we need to do is try and make things happen on the ground for pollinators. So this is where it starts to get more Swaledale appropriate and more interesting for people who maybe aren't into maps as I am. So yeah, we need to create and restore habitat. And as I said, we need that to be over 2 hectares. We need this to be big blocks of habitat. And for that to happen, we need to be working with farmers and landowners. These are the people that can really make a difference to that beelines network. So examples here, this is when green hay is about to be cut for introduction to another site, as I'm sure many of you are familiar from other projects that have been running in the Swaledale area. But this is a big UK map. It's all sorts of scenarios. You know, there are parts of the map where farmland may not be dominant. So we work, for example, here we work with local parks, local wildlife groups, and trying to reintroduce positive habitat management. A big part of the problem with parks is not as much a problem in the Swaledale area, but in huge swathes of the country, parks are just gang mowed to death by local authority grounds maintenance teams, and we're trying to train that out of them. They got into the habit of, I was reading, there was somewhere the other day that had 30 cuts a year on their green space, which is a weekly cut throughout the entire growing season, which is a waste of money. It's carbon intensive, and it stops that green space being of any value for wildlife. So things such as this is trying to get people back into cut and collect approaches where you're removing the nutrients from those grasslands and trying to recreate the low fertility that a lot of wildflower species need to thrive, as well as introducing wildflowers to them. But again, it does, in terms of that stuff on farms, it's not just about doing stuff on the ground ourselves and on projects we're partnered up with. It's about making farmers want to do this themselves. There's some farmers that are fantastically open to wildflower restoration work on their land. We get people approaching us for advice on how to do it, which is fantastic. But equally, we've tried to link up with cluster farms and organise farmer groups and give them talks and show them around sites where stuff is happening on the ground and try to inspire them to want to do it themselves. So this is some example here of some revert arable field margin work that we've worked with and managed to get them to do positive things. If you can get perennials as we have here, that's exactly what you want. Ideally, we want a bigger strip. We always, as I said, bigger, better, more joined up is what we want. We'd like whole fields. But if we can get farmers just to do field edges like that, that's a good starting point. A lot of the time, I think things like that are a gateway. If they see the positive impact of doing some margins, which fit in with their agro-environment schemes, it's a stepping stone for them towards doing that whole field reversion that we need. Even nature reserves. You'd be surprised how many nature reserves can have their management improve for pollinators. Whether it's about so for example, a lot of nature reserves have, if you're ever involved with that sort of thing, have big management plans where its whole compartments are managed in the same way and cut at the same time every year. Why? Why can they not go on a rotational cut so you can allow more things to flower? And this is on a brownfield nature reserve, which we manage with the RSPB and the Land Trust down in Canby Island called Canby Wick. It's a former oil refinery, which is one of the best invertebrate sites in the UK. We're working with them on clearing that scrub at the background there, which has very little value for anything except a handful of bird species in the area. So we're restoring that to the shingle, sand and dredgings that were dumped on it as part of the site being created 50 years ago. So we're getting rid of that scrub and reinstating open habitats and making sure that the management cuts there fit in with working for pollinators. And I just really like this photo. So it's not just nature reserves. This actually correlates with working for farmers as well. So on the south coast, where we have that six-banded nomad bee that I mentioned, we're working with the farmers there to try and restore key forage species on the cliff-top grasslands. And infrastructure. Well, there's a lot of talk about road verges. A lot of that's thanks to Plantlife, who've done some fantastic work. I know you've got was it on Honours doing a talk in the next couple of weeks, I think.
Yeah.
Plantlife have done some fantastic work on putting road verges high up the agenda, and a lot of local authorities are paying attention. Again, this plays into the carbon and ecology side of things because they're having their road crews go up and down, cutting verges throughout the summer where they can be left to be thriving resources like this. And it's more than that. We're also working with beelines. We're working with Network Rail, identifying where their land assets overlap with beelines as well, to see what they can do, whether it's vacant sidings that can be left to be reverted to wildflowers, or whether it's bringing back flowers along the corridors that have been sprayed and overmanaged for too many years. And we're having different conversations with different highways areas as well about how they can do target their restoration work. So early on, I mentioned about it being something to help target that national effort. If Highways England, for example, are going to create 100 hectares, just a figure of plucked out the air, wildflower grassland, it would be better for them to target it within beelines. So if everyone aligns their efforts, if local authorities, highways, Network Rail, if everyone can focus their effort within beelines, and it's not as a Buglife own thing, this is that shared endeavour I said, it's then magnifying the impact of what everyone does by coordinating it properly. So this is the real key behind what we're trying to do with beelines. And again, a lovely knapweed field verge. And I know Swaledale is the least urban, one of the least urban landscapes you could probably imagine. Beelines, we still need to cut through. We need to go through Birmingham and Leicester and London. We need to make the whole landscape pollinator permeable. So it's about doing things in all urban spaces as well. And this is down in, as part of our Urban Buzz project, this was down in Falmouth, Again, it's just making sure that it's helping people to appreciate the importance of flowers in their spaces as well. Part of Beelines isn't just winning a biodiversity argument, it's about winning a hearts and minds approach as well. It's about making people want to have this in their parks. So one of the things we've often struggled with is people have this preconceived idea that mown green space and scattered trees equals wildlife. With my swapping my Beelines hat for my planning hat, a lot of my work with planning has been on protecting wildlife-rich brownfield sites, which have this terrible reputation as all being these derelict wastelands, even though some of our most biodiverse sites in the UK happen to be former industrial sites that have been reclaimed by nature. There's this misnomer that green equals good and brown equals bad when it comes to wildlife, when actually a lot of our green fields tend to be mown within an inch of their life or grazed within an inch of their life. So these are similar issues. We're trying to counter cultural ideologies of what constitutes a wildlife-rich space. So I thought I'd just give you a couple of examples of how Beelines has been actually delivering on the ground. So I was going to take us to the west of England, where we've had a partnership with the Avon Wildlife Trust now for 7 years. So they're one of our earliest project partners. And originally, we actually started a project up where we sourced the funding and we worked with them on their nature reserves and on their local wildlife site network, where we were creating wildflower grasslands, restoring them by doing scrub clearance, all of the usual things you'd expect to hear for wildflowers. But that's been completely turned on its head now. So the Avon Wildlife Trust realised Beelines helped them to target their own work. It helped them to engage with landowners. It helped them to deliver their own pollinator ambitions. So they have now sourced funding on a number of occasions for them to lead on work and just get technical advice from us. It's a full 180 in terms of who's driving that work. And because they've taken it fully in-house, it's now led to 140 hectares of wildflower-rich grassland habitat being restored, which is an enormous area. And that's including green haying, scrub clearance, reinstating of management, reinstating grazing, all of this working with volunteers and landowners. And this just goes to show that if you reach out if you cast quite a wide net and see who would really like to deliver this sort of work for pollinators, you can have a huge range of partners. So we've had various local authorities and AOMBs and water companies and other NGOs, landowners like the National Trust, who could be a key partner for us at delivering Beelines because of the sheer volume, the sheer amount of land they manage. But also groups like the FWAG Southwest, so that's the Southwest branch of the National FWAG, which no longer functions nationally, but it's a network of farmers. So it's similar to working with cluster farmers as and when they spring up. It's when you're working with farmers and landowners, it seems to work best when it's done in a farmer-led capacity and they're working collaboratively for shared goals. So something like Beelines can really help if it fits with the ambition of local farmers. If they're doing it together, they can coordinate delivery within that Beelines. So it's that important prioritization that I mentioned. But Beelines is it's a brilliant thing for people as well. I mean, it gives us opportunities to have funded projects where we can get kids out doing bug hunts, the kind of things that we know are really important to instill that interest and passion in the next generation, which I'd like to think is a big part of a lot of the climate discussions that you've been having in the meetings, is trying to inspire people to want to act, and that starts at all ages. So on the right hand side there, I think that was volunteers from a bank who stepped out just to help us with doing some wildflowers in their lunch break. It can be anything that it gives people that connection to the land, that gives them a reason to give a damn about the park down the road. And when that wildflower area was done, it was added to our Beeline map. So it all starts to add to a national picture, but making it local for people. This is where I think Beelines has quite a useful niche. It can allow people to work collaboratively locally within that stretch of Beeline while contributing to a national effort. So it kind of links neatly through. And again, I've just realised I've repeated some of these photos further on. We even had community support officers helping us in Cardiff, digging wildflower areas. It's even, I mean, in Richmond here, I've been amazed at some of the bedding plants that they're putting into the parks and around places. These are things that are usually imported, grown in peat. They have to be replaced a few times a year. Why do we have that when we can have either pollinator-friendly garden plants at the bottom there, and you can work with people to plant them out. You know, stop having it something that local authorities send their crews out every 5 minutes to replant. Have local people be involved with looking after it and planting it up. And on the top there, we've got a rather nifty living roof bike shelter in Cardiff as well, which I'd like to see more of springing up everywhere. And this is that report I mentioned earlier. On the right is a screen grab of that animation that we showed. But earlier in March this year, we released our Beeline's Insect Superhighways report, which we've needed for years, but we waited for us to complete the UK map so that when we released it into the world, it was relevant to all of the local authorities who read it. So that document there is something which outlines what beelines are, what we're trying to achieve, and has case studies, and is really a document we're using to try and inspire other organisations to want to act. So it finally gets a bit more local, and I suspect a lot of you here are going to know more about these projects than me. As I said, I've only moved up to Richmond a year ago. But this is the beeline for the Swaledale area. It rather neatly, thanks to the nature of a lot of the habitats being limited by the geography and the altitude, you can see it pretty much follows the Swale Valley right along. So a lot of you, I'm assuming, would be familiar with the Haytime project that was delivered by the Yorkshire Dales Millennium Trust and the National Park and various other partners. I know there's the same old faces have been delivering a few of these projects with the wildlife NGOs and environmental NGOs. So again, you'll know them all. But a big part of that project was addressing some of the issues I mentioned. I said that farmers they like to coordinate and collaborate together, but what that project did that was really, really important was it realised that yes, there's agro-environment scheme funding out there. There's funding for farmers to go and do stuff, but it still wasn't happening because there's difficulty in getting seed, there's difficulty in making the connections and identifying useful contractors, and all of this. Green haying and wildflower creation work needs coordination. It needs someone to oversee it, and YDMT were able to step into that, ask farmers what do they need to make it happen. So again, it reached beyond Swaledale. It was a much wider area. I don't have the Swaledale stats, unfortunately, but they still managed to have 69 schemes delivering over 279 hectares over 6 summers, which is an extraordinary achievement for the project. In terms of what they actually did, I'm not sure how many people in this are familiar with all the techniques of wildflower creation and restoration work, but they broke their work down into two channels, basically. So the restoration work and enhancement work. So restoration work is very much where you're dealing with a site that's really declined from intensive management. We see a lot of them in the Dales, lots of sheep nibbled green bits with nothing else growing in between them. So this is trying to restore the very baseline of the wildflowers you need. So, and the right grass species as well. So it's getting yellow rattle, red clovers, and meadow buttercup, very quintessential meadow species that you can use as the starting point, and getting that traditional management reinstated. Making sure that flowers are allowed to go through the full season of flowering, which is exactly what pollinators need, and being allowed to go to seed, so there's more, to help regenerate. And there's also enhancements, which were, some meadows have that middle ground where they've just been, whether it's through fertilization or changes in grazing and cutting practices, they've just become less species rich than they used to be. So it's about introducing more of the species rich species like the wood cranes, Buglife glowflower and great burnet, for example. There's different tiers, and within beelines nationally, that's always been the case. There's been starting from scratch sites and enhancements. Where possible, we'd always prefer to enhance sites that are already there. If you've got a site that used to be a wildflower rich meadow, bring that management back, reintroduce seed. It's better than starting from scratch with an amenity grassland or an arable field, because don't start from scratch if you've got something that's a part way along that ladder, because wildflower restoration is a very long term, and it's a very difficult to predict beast, actually. Part of the problem we find with wildflower work is that people hear you're doing a meadow, and the next year they expect to go there and find this picturesque, quintessential meadow with all the different colours and flower structures that you get from a meadow that's been there for hundreds of years. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of time to bring the species back, to drive down the fertility, it can take decades. There's evidence that after 100 years, restored wildflower meadows still show differences with meadows that have been kept intact for that time. So we're trying to reverse a lot of damage here. But what I did with Haytime was they used a number of different techniques to do that wildflower restoration. So you can buy commercially bought seed for wildflower projects, as Buglife has done for a huge amount of our projects, particularly in urban areas. When it comes to somewhere like Swaledale, where there's it has history, there's biodiversity value, you really want to make sure you're sourcing your seed locally, and that underpinned how they did Haytime. And it's the best practice that's recommended by Plant Life as well. If you look at their Magnificent Meadows work, which created some fantastically interesting resources for anyone wanting to do meadow restoration work. So again, this here just talks about the fact that green hay cutting is what traditionally has been done. We've been doing that at the moment with one of our projects along the River Severn down in Shropshire. And again, you can cut the seeded flower heads from meadows, and 1 hectare will do 3 to 5 hectares. So on the receptor site, for those that don't know, you'll create bare ground and you'll spread the hay that's cut from a donor site. It's very simple. You cut the hay from a species rich site and you spread it across your poor site. And the more bare ground, the better. So to make a site better, you often have to trash it first. You'll get a green grassed site, and you'll run machinery back and forth, power harrowing it until it's 50% bare ground. So you make a bit of a mud slick, but much like if you're doing things in the garden, you need that mud for seed to make contact with. They did trial other methods as well within that. So they tried the hay concentrate method, which pretty much just cuts off the top of the hay when they're going through, but it's a bit more weather dependent and machinery dependent. They also tried things like brush harvesting as well, where it literally just gets the seed but not the grass. But that's very much requires the weather to be perfect at just the right time when your seed's ripening. And you guys live out in Swaledale, I'm pretty sure you can confirm that the weather very rarely plays ball like that. But did it work? Importantly, yes. This is from their own final report from their 6-year project. The left-hand columns, sorry, in those two are the baseline, and the right-hand side is their surveys at the end of the project. And it showed species diversity going up, and it showed species richness going up. It's a very slow movement, by the way. Some things they established work right away. Things like eyebrights and yellow rattle, which are very just important meadow species. They colonize quickly, but they're both quite important species because they're hemiparasites of the competitive grasses that have often found their way into improved grasslands, and they're a really important first step. And all this does is point out the need that just going in and chucking seed on a site isn't enough. It needs long-term management. It might need further top-up. So that's why it's brilliant that other projects are now happening in the area, which we'll talk about. In terms of projects past, there is actually the Richmond example as well, where Buglife actually did one of our first beelines delivery projects on the ground in Richmond, possibly or definitely a result of the fact that the first person to work at beelines, to work at Buglife doing beelines, lived just around Fremington. So that's probably why this came up as the first project. But that was with the Richmondshire Landscape Trust, the National Trust, and North Yorkshire County Council. And again, it used the same techniques, which is identifying neglected grasslands and bringing them into condition through scrub control, reintroducing traditional management, and harvesting local wildflower seed to restore 20 hectares of sites. And also introduced fencing and gates as well, which can be very important in terms of the major costs associated with trying to bring grazing back to a site. But it clearly works. I don't know how well many of you know the Richmond meadows themselves, but I was up in the 9-acre paddock this year, which is just pretty much opposite Round How when you're on your way into Richmond on the other side of the road. That looked spectacular this year, 9-acre field. So I think we contributed to some of that as well. And this is the all-important scrub control. Tree species and scrub species can really invade grasslands. It's important to realise that they are also an important component. A lot of time I've spent a lot of my time trying to stand up and wave the flag for scrub. So as much as scrub dominating a grassland is bad, scattered scrub and a mosaic of scrub in a grassland can actually be really important. It provides structure and shelter, and also provides early season spring forage for emerging queen bumblebees, for example. And again, here's examples of us doing some of that harvesting of seed. And there you go, definite proof it's Richmond from the castle in the background there. This is working with volunteers to put plug plants in. So seeding is fantastic. It's long term. Sometimes a combination of seeding and plug plants, so very young wildflowers, can give it that instant fix, which people often require, and sadly funders often require as well. But it gives people a chance to get there on their hands and knees, put plants in the ground themselves. It gives that local sense of ownership. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunities in Swaledale for it, even if it's those small village greens, for example, for this sort of work to be done. So in terms of what happened with that Richmond project, it included 9-acre fields, South Bank and Sleagill, some of the National Trust grassland lenses at Hudswell Woods and Round Howe, and a series of local wildlife sites as well. I mean, in the name of, probably largely in the name of engagement, it even included doing pollinator planting at Friary Gardens here as well. So again, making it very present. I'm sure you'll all have been at talks from Krista Nelson at some point as well. So I'm sure. So I got some information from her on the T-Swell Naturally Connected project, which again, I'm sure you'll all be aware of because it's a massive, big, ambitious project, which I was really pleased to see come to fruition. So this is between the North Pennines AONB and the Yorkshire Dales National Park, all to try and connect Upper Teesdale and Upper Swaledale. And it's a huge, ambitious piece of work trying to restore 225 hectares across that project area. Putting that money into context, by the way, I mean, I've just at Buglife we've been working on Back from the Brink programme with 7 species NGOs, including the RSPB, Plant Life, Butterfly Conservation, and everyone, and Natural England, doing 19 projects, which included whole landscapes, whole species projects. We've been leading a project working across Windsor and Savernake and Sherwood Forest, some nationally important deadwood sites. Our budget was smaller than this budget, is what I'm getting at. That was a 4-year funded project with all those NGOs across a huge amount of England, and our budget was smaller than this. So this is a really important investment in the wildlife and the farmed landscape in Swaledale and Teesdale. It really is significant. And so far, I haven't got them mapped, unfortunately, but they have already delivered 7 hectares of wildflower restoration in Swaledale in that first year, which I think is really impressive, considering getting anything achieved in your first year is incredibly difficult with these projects. So well done to them. And if you haven't seen it, this is a map that I've pulled out of an update from them. And that shows intended green haying sites in green and plug planted sites in pink. I'm sure you guys on this call could probably think of some nice opportunities scattered between them as well. And we will, of course, be working with the T-Swale lot to make sure that we capture what they're doing for our beelines map. So yeah, for Swaledale, I suppose it brings to question of what else could be done. I mean, obviously, when you get out, the parks are much more the Richmond end of things, but what else could be done in the villages where there's planters or birding? I mean, are there opportunities on small village greens, in churchyards, in planters in the middle of villages to provide little pockets of pollinator-rich habitat? And what can people do themselves? I mean, nationally, gardens make up such an a huge area. Proportion would be the wrong word. A huge area of opportunities in gardens throughout the UK. And it doesn't have to be meadows. It can be, there's pollinator-friendly garden plants, like I said, or creating nesting habitat. There's been people like to think they can do something for pollinators. So there's been a real growth in bee homes, but it's also providing ground nesting opportunities. Can we do things in our schools with wildlife gardens? Allotments, I mentioned Richmond quite a bit because it's the big area I'm familiar with here, but we've got all the allotments up towards the wildflower areas. We've done things. Allotments often include a good amount of forage for pollinators, and some of the wildlife loving allotment holders have really good planted areas as well with wildflowers. But what else could they do? Could they work together and coordinate their efforts? And more importantly, there's big private estates. Do we know any that could be persuaded to restore grasslands? I know we know lots of us know farmers, but how can we persuade them to want to be part of something like beelines? And it is about making it personal and making people care. So we have some resources on our website if people do want to do things in their gardens. It's always important, I think, to make people realise that they can do little things themselves that all add up, and that's what that beelines map does. And it can be quite intimidating when we talk about wildflower-rich grasslands and meadows a lot, because people don't want their garden to look wild. which is a shame. So, you know, we can get people to plant fruit trees, plant spring bulbs, have ponds with you know, wetland flowers around the edges. Growing fruit and veg in your garden can make a really important contribution. I'm sure if anyone here has ever had a tomato plant in their garden, they'll have seen it teeming. And importantly, you know, try to manage your garden as you'd like the countryside to be managed. Keep it messy. You don't have to tidy up everything. Stop using pesticides, and again, go peat free. That's that very heavy overlap with that climate message. You know, keep peat in the ground, not putting in your, not, you know, extracted to help them grow the plants for your garden. We do also, if you do want to get ambitious and have meadows in your garden, we've helped to select on our website as well some of the best species you could include as part of that. And again, get creative. I mean, we know where we could have similar things such as this. If you're going to have a bike shelter, if you're going to have a shed, can we green roof it? And it doesn't have to be big areas. This is in Cardiff, a little corner of unused grass by a library that was mown to death. So what have they done? Put in wildflowers. It doesn't take a lot. Little spare patches all add up. And again, roundabouts, again, not a huge amount of these once you get into Swaledale, but the roundabout around the corner from here is all bedding plants and unpollinator friendly shrubs. So why not put some wildflowers on that and get people involved, make it personal. And in terms of inspiring people to care, it often isn't, a lot of it isn't about necessarily doing habitat work on the ground. It's inspiring people. So we did part of our Urban Buzz project up in Leicester, working with communities to create 100 wildflower patches throughout Leicester. We think it got to about 130 for Leicester in the end. But off the back of what we were doing and inspiring local communities, the local authority put their money where their mouth was. Not only did they do their own wildflower work, they committed a mural on. They got an area paved so they could put a mural on, which may not meet the climate ambitions when you think about all the concrete that's gone into those paving stones. But it's bringing people closer and it's bringing out the passion in people. It's all part of the whole conversation. And yeah, getting kids out doing things, getting them looking for bugs, getting their hands dirty, going into schools and things like the animation we've got. I really hope people will show to their kids. It's making them want to do things. There's that again. Sorry about that. And importantly, add to that beelines map. So on our beelines map at the moment for the UK, we've got just shy of 2,100 dots on that map. And that ranges from school wildlife gardens to I think we've got a 60 hectare wildflower restoration somewhere that someone's uploaded. So anyone can add to this map. And this is where I think Beelines has the opportunity to be quite special. I mentioned it connects that local to the national, is people can actively add their dot to the map. It is people making their own little contribution. And if we can use Beelines to help inspire other landowners or anyone within Swaledale to add just their little map, whether it's doing stuff in their garden, whether it's persuading a farmer to have a small part of their land restored to wildflowers, it all starts to add up for Swaledale. And that's me. Thank you for letting me rant at you for about 50 minutes.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Jamie. I mean, what an amazingly ambitious project, enormous scope, and a sneak peek into the way in which it's been researched and developed, which is, I can only say, extremely impressive. And the one thing that comes across loud and clear is your enthusiasm, your passion for this. So that's as a tonic for all of us. That's wonderful stuff to hear and to listen to that passion. So thank you for that, and thank you very much for sharing. I'll take some questions from people in just a moment, if I may. But first of all, there are quite a lot of changes in legislation that affect farming in particular, which I guess is relevant to Richmondshire. And we've begun to notice that some of the farmers who were previously remunerated for not cutting their wildflower meadows have now lost those grants and are beginning to cut their wildflower meadows where previously they hadn't. We've got elms coming down the pipeline, which is a complete sea change in funding arrangements for farming. How do you see the legislative context of this, either supporting or wrestling with beelines? Have you got a view?
I think the biggest legislative challenge we're going to have is the pro-tree planting agenda at the moment. That's kind of almost a sideways, and we'll get back to the farming in a moment. But I think the big problem we're finding as an organisation dealing with farming everywhere, not just Swaledale, is that there's so much public support because it's something it links to everything. It links to the climate discussion, of course it does. And trees are incredibly important. There's a real danger in Swaledale that it could go into areas, it could be restored to wildflower-rich grassland. There's also a risk, of course, of some, whether intended or unintended, planting on some of the peat on the uplands as well. And there's huge opportunities in Swaledale for there to be woodland. There should be woodland in lots of areas of Swaledale. It's just about getting it in the right place. But in terms of farmers and elms, I think it's the issue we've got is, I think you're right. There are people who are currently out of agri-environment schemes and waiting for the new schemes to be open. So I think that's not as who are making decisions, like you said, they're cutting wildflower areas because they're currently in a bit of a no man's land. And I think that's the big problem. I don't think it's necessarily the substance of elms coming through that is going to be the problem there. It's just the timing of it all. In terms of elms, I'd be lying if I knew all of the ins and outs of the agri-environment schemes. We've got a pollinator officer at Buglife who's much more familiar with the actual face-to-face aspects of talking with farmers. But my take-home message from it is the old agri-environment schemes were really not fit for purpose anyway. Yes, there was still some good happening out of it because if the right farmer in the right place makes the right decisions, then there's positive wildlife outcomes. But I think the problem we had was that too many people were getting paid for not delivering a great deal. So I hope that elms, thanks to the inclusion of thanks to the need for them to be delivering environmental goods, I'm quite optimistic that someone like Swaledale could benefit from it. It's just that glitch in the middle while they adapt to the new schemes.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Let me turn questions over to anyone else on the call here. So I can't see a lot of people. They seem to have cameras off. Yeah. But if I've got Kyle with his hand up now. Perhaps Kyle, you want to ask a question?
Yes. Thank you, Mike. Jamie, after your video, I seemed to lose your pictures, and all I had was your head and your great enthusiasm. But I enjoyed it enormously. Would have been good to have had
my enthusiastic head.
What I wanted to ask you is, we've put in some hay meadows. They've been in for about 10 years now, and they have done extremely well. And we put in some domestic bees. Does that put pressure on the sort of indigenous population of bumblebees and insects that are already there? There are about 5 hives, and they're incredibly industrious. I see them during the course of the year. It's very difficult to know, though, whether they're actually impacting on the insects that are there.
Unfortunately, they absolutely will be. There's lots of scientific evidence out there, not anecdotal, but scientific evidence that honeybees do compete with native pollinators for wildflowers, particularly when you're somewhere like Swaledale, where you might have a lovely hay meadow, but as I'm sure you're dealing with the fact that the next door neighbour might not have any pollen or nectar resources on their land at all. So what's happening is they're literally out competing some of our wild pollinators. And it's not just in the countryside, even in London, for example. I always find this because urban beekeeping has been something that's had a real uptick in the last kind of 5 to 10 years. They're now telling people to not have hives. They're telling people to reduce the number of hives because there's a Buglife blog on this. If you Google Buglife blog honeybee, we put something out which kind of had the figures in there, but they compete with wild pollinators. They suppress their numbers, And there is also the risk of transmitting disease as well, as hives are often moved around. That's more the beekeeping industry, I suspect, than yourself. But it's difficult because people are very well intentioned. It's not done with any malice, of course. People think bees good, so they'll introduce hives into places where there are existing wild populations, and all that happens over time is, unless there's a huge increase alongside that of wildflowers, it tends to suppress the native pollinators, the bumblebees, the solitary bees, for example.
I'm very sad to hear that.
Sorry.
I like honey.
I'm sure you put it in with very good intentions, of course, because it's help. Yes. It's bees and it's flowers, and that's what people want. Well, lots of people like us want to see.
Thank you.
Oh, gosh, terribly sad and counterintuitive in some ways, isn't it? When you think you're trying to do your best for building pollinator numbers, but fascinating question and an interesting answer to that. Anybody else who's got a question? If you stick your hand up, got Adele, and then I'll come off after.
Yes.
Adele will come to Naomi.
Can anyone? Carl, can you see the chat on the side?
No, I just I'm seeing faces and people. But that's fine. I'm okay on that.
I've just in the chat put in the link to that blog I mentioned. I don't know if I think some of you know each other. If you could someone could get that to Kyle. I just Googled Buglife blog honeybee, and it comes up, which is Save the Bees, but which ones? A Buglife blog. So worth you reading, I think.
Excellent, thank you. Adele, do you want to ask your question first?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. That was really so interesting. In fact, I think I could bombard you with a whole host of questions, to be honest. We could be here for another couple of hours. But we're trying to not make mistakes. I mean, it's so easy, isn't it, as Kyle's just said, to make mistakes with what you do. Just on our own land here, we have divided our fields this year into two halves. And we're putting some woodland in the lower parts of our land and planting about nearly 2,000 trees, actually. But above that, we've got an area of grassland that we're desperately trying to turn into wildflower meadows. We're slightly high up, really. We're not really the sort of lower meadow type of land. I don't think you could even call it, it's more like pasture land, grazing land. So we're going to stop it being grazed by the sheep. We tried a patch of wildflowers that we sowed last year around November time, cleared the soil, grass away, and we've got the soil. Sowed our seed, which we sowed far more than we should have done in hindsight. But very little came up this year at all. And we were feeling quite disappointed, actually, when by the time we got to sort of June, there was very little there at all. And the meadows are better.
Had the grass regenerated in that time, or was it just still bare ground?
No, it was still pretty bare ground, to be honest. But we obviously must have done something wrong with the seed. So it's finding the right place for the seed, where we get the seed from, I'm assuming, sowing it at the right time, and having the right species. And I think that was my sort of question is, where can we've got some support at the minute through advice from Krista Nelson, but it's just, where can we get the help to make sure that we do the right things, such that in 5 years' time, it's regenerating and doing what we want it to do for this? Because I think we must be right on that beeline, actually.
I think what you probably got is, it sounds like you're in that kind of position where that sort of land isn't going to ever fit in with like an agri environment scheme thing for wildflower restoration, is it? Because it's kind of like you said, it's also not suitable for, I'm guessing, for proper machine wildflower restoration anyway, I'm assuming, with the land. I think for a lot of these things, it's about finding the right species.
Yeah.
I mean, Whenever I talk to anyone about wildflower work, a big part of it is tempering expectation. So like I said, these things can take, if you're doing a proper meadow restoration, it can take decades of moving things in the right direction, and you still don't know what the ultimate destination is going to be, because you don't know how a wildflower sward is going to adapt to any local place. I mean, if I were you, I'd start by just testing a couple of. I mean, you might be surprised what comes up this year, because a lot of things in that mix would have been. I'm sorry, next year. Sorry, because you sowed it over last winter, didn't you? You might be surprised what comes up, because obviously a lot of these perennials look fairly unimpressive rosettes in their first year. And oh, sorry, it was last winter, wasn't it? So this summer coming is when you might see something. But there are some things which should be able to. I mean, I have the various species that I always think always work well are things like common knapweed. Knapweed round here always seems to do well. So I just focus on a few key species that you think are going to do well more than anything. I don't know. I trust Krista's judgment, if I'm perfectly honest, because obviously she's done a whole lot of this. So I don't know what she recommended.
And she's actually been in the fields, and they've planted a few plug plants this year. And they've done a survey of the plants that we've got already. So I'm hoping and I'm very positive about Krista's advice in the fields. I think I was just surprised at how little grew out of our test patch. So that's why I was asking, really, you know, are we doing the right thing? And maybe, yes, I'm probably expecting too much too soon.
Well, seed and soils can all be very moody and changeable. Literally, you can have, if you look at some places where wildflower restoration has gone on, you can have a big 5-10 meter patch where the flowers have taken fantastically. 5 meters to the right, nothing's come through. Sometimes it can literally be down to soil variety, different hydrology. It can be incredibly varied across it. So if you just try to patch, don't be discouraged. Like I said, I'd go. Krista knows what she's doing. She really does. And I would say plug plants are the way forward, because they give things a head start. But of course, that's an expensive way to go, because they're not cheap things. I mean, I don't know if those plug plants go well, but seeding doesn't, and you feel like you need to give things a kickstart. I don't know if you've got the room in your own garden to potentially buy some seed, grow it through, and plant them out as plugs yourself.
Yeah, I think maybe that's the other option. On the plus side, I have to say it's been our best year for insects in the garden: butterflies, bees, hoverflies, everything. I don't think we've had a better year than this year. So there are bits of us that are very positive, I have to say.
Brilliant, thank you. Let me go to Naomi, and then I'll come back to Kyle because he put his hand up again. Let me go to Naomi first.
So thank you. That was a really interesting talk. So I just wanted to ask a question about how to manage a very small wildflower meadow that I created about 5 years ago in what was an old allotment garden that I took over. It was very, very neglected. In my sort of ignorance, I planted some fruit trees with wildflower meadow underneath. I spent quite a lot of effort. So I seeded it, and that worked quite well. But then I also added plug plants over the next year or so. So I had good biodiversity. But I think I'm losing that a bit, because I can't bring myself to cut it until about September because it's so flowery. And I know that I think I need to cut it at different times in order to give different species an advantage. I think I do. But
I mean, the September cut should be fine. The problem is, are you having some species take over at the expense of others?
Yes. I think
what's gone mad?
Knapweed is taking over, I think, and the grasses are diminishing, I would say. So I've sort of got the opposite problem.
Well, knapweed is a wonderful plant. It's a bit brutish, actually, I suppose, isn't it? When you think when it establishes, it really establishes well. So the only thing I can suggest for that is that perhaps it might be worth pulling out by the roots a few areas. This sounds counterintuitive. I'm telling you to dig up wildflowers. Find someone else that would like your knapweed before you pull it up. Yeah, replant the knapweed. Yeah. because they grow quite big. They grow quite early in the year as a rosette, and it stays there. So it's just dominates. If you think of a big rosette of knapweed, they're quite big, and it takes up a big proportion of a small meadow. So although they're fantastic, if you did want to allow some other species in there, it's just a case of thinning out the knapweed, I think.
Right. Okay.
This happens very regularly in any meadow area you do. It'll often be knapweed that takes over, or oxeye daisy that takes over, depending on the conditions and where it is. You'll always have some dominant things. It can't really be helped. You could I'd still suggest you leave it to September to cut it, because you're producing more seed, and you're like every little bit of nectar and pollen get used by pollinators. It might be that you want to create a few scrapes. And I'm not sure how big the area is. If you pulled up a knapweed, for example, you might want to scrape the area a bit bigger to allow the opportunity for other things to germinate. If you do that before things have set seed, then you're creating a nice little opportunity for things to come through.
Yeah.
And you could always, if you wanted to do, in fact, you could always do that when things are going to seed. Cut your knapweed flower heads off so they don't seed anymore. Create the bare areas to allow other things to germinate and colonize it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Naomi, are you connected with Krista Nelson at all?
No, I'm not.
Would it be helpful if we give you her contact or introduce you so that you can have a chat with her and let us see your meadow?
Please, that would be wonderful. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. We'll take that as an action. Make sure we do that. Kyle, you put your hand up. Can I
just quickly before Kyle goes? Anne and Carol, and there were a few questions in the chat while I was talking that didn't pop up because I was sharing my. So Anne, going back to nearly an hour ago, sorry everyone, Anne was asking why the moors were grey in Devon. That's because when we do the beelines mapping, we have an altitudinal cutoff, because when you get above, I can't remember if it's 250 or 300 meters, the value for pollinators starts to decline. You often have some rarities associated with those high altitude habitats, but we do the cutoff. The majority of pollinators will stay below that 250 meter line. Yeah, and also made a point about public perception of mowing, which I'm supporting, I think, what I was saying. Carol asked, are we encouraging homeowners to use hedges instead of high wooden fences? Not anywhere, actually, that I can see, but with my planning hat on, I do end up talking to quite a few developers about different developments, and we are often pushing for hedges as boundary features. So we're not doing anything like that, but we always flag up hedges when we can. Margaret asked if the racecourse is included. So my understanding is from talking to the Richmondshire Landscape Trust just the other day, they have been collecting green hay this year from the racecourse. So I was up at the racecourse in the summer, and I don't know if it was the weather or what, it looked really, really fantastic. It was for such a well-used space with dog walkers and such a big kind of amenity area. It was absolutely teeming with wildflowers. And so I was really pleased to hear the Landscape Trust are now using that as a donor site for other green hay work. And Anne also said something about trees being planted. They're fig. So she presumes incentive will be greater for farmers to plant commercially viable trees. Government will still be able to boast about X thousand trees being planted, and they might be the wrong place or non-native. All concerns. So this is where things get interesting with the climate and biodiversity ambitions, because a lot of the quicker carbon capturing species are ones with relatively negligible biodiversity value. So we are having to put up a big fight for tree planting. But on top of that, we're putting up a big fight to make sure tree planting is native species and site appropriate. It's really important. But and as I said, not planting on open habitats. I'm not sure if I did say it, but just this week I've had to talk to the MOD. I've had to reach out to MOD contacts I've got in Essex because they wanted to plant 2,000 trees on a calcareous grassland down there for the Queen's Jubilee. Nothing says honouring the Queen like, planting on a priority habitat. And there are issues with tree planting as well. So with my planning hat on, I realise this isn't local, but it's still the same issues. I've been involved with the Lower Thames Crossing down in Essex and Kent, and where they're damaging destroying a section of ancient woodland to add a link road on. they've got these ambitious tree planting targets. And myself, the Woodland Trust and the Kent Wildlife Trust all agreed that what they should be trying to do is natural regeneration in places. Everyone's so keen to put trees in the ground, just keep the grazing animals out for a while, and often the trees do their own thing and come back. And they come back with much more ecologically functional woodland, better structured woodland, more diverse woodland, which is delivering for biodiversity from the beginning. And part of the problem we're having is that we mention this to for the scheme for the Lower Thames Cross, and they should do more natural regeneration. And they're accepting bits of it, but there are some areas where they want that quick impact, where there's a visual thing. They need a quick impact. They need people to see that trees are happening. They also need people to. They also, of course, have to deal with the fact that people think somewhere naturally regenerating is just being abandoned. It comes back to the same thing as grassland, where people like things to be tidy. And for some reason, the look of a whole line of those planted trees with the plastic collars make people think that something is happening. So it makes them comfortable. And the third thing on that is that they've already said they're going to plant X thousand number of trees. And if we make natural regeneration, even though it leads to a better biodiversity outcome, they'll be seen to be failing on their biodiversity targets because they're not planting enough trees. Even though, of course, they often plant them in at like 5 to a square metre and then have to go back and thin them because they put in too many. So there's a huge amount of issues around tree planting that are very unfortunate. That unfortunately, sorry, I don't think we're going to resolve overnight.
Wow.
Sorry.
Left us totally confused now. Kyle, you had put your hand up briefly. I don't know whether you want to come back.
Well, it was really to respond to Adele and her efforts to establish a meadow. And I was going to mention that how we went about ours. We did it in conjunction with Cumbria Wildlife Trust, and they were they sourced the seed, and they also sourced green hay. And listening to Jamie, I remember the fields were power harrowed, and they looked almost like they'd been ploughed when we went about putting the seed on. It established fairly quickly. The sowing of the seed was fairly random. I remember sitting in the back of a pickup and throwing it out as we went along. And then the green hay arrived in big bales, and we had to sort of push it out very quickly. You hadn't got to let the bales heat up, or apparently it damaged the seed. And it was hard work, and you kicked the stuff all over the field. I think they now spread it out with a machine of some description. In fact, we put some more in fairly recently, and they did that. In fact, the field is now good enough to be a donor site. It's come on very, very quickly. And lots of once the yellow rattle got established, everything else came along. But some of the plants take quite a while to establish. It's taken quite a while for not cranesbill, knapweed to come. And it's great now it is here. I really like knapweed. I think it's one of the best flowers for insects. And this time of year, we've got all sorts of finches, particularly goldfinch, in big flocks on the knapweed, which is really good to see. They've been on the thistleheads, and now they come on to the knapweed. But just be patient and keep trying. We have some land up at about 1,000 feet that we've just made. They were already sort of verging on hay meadows, but we've put some of the green hay on them this year after sort of messing them up a bit. But I think they'll come quite easily. They've already got yellow rattle and stuff in them. But it'll be interesting to see. But that's at 1,000 feet. I don't know what height you're at.
Yeah, we're about 1,000 feet actually. So yeah. That's quite reassuring to hear.
Well, that's the highest land. But it'll come, I'm sure. I'm confident. But anyway, best of luck.
Thank you. It's good to hear. Thank you,
Yeah.
Carl.
I'll tell you what, there's some of the most rewarding things you can put in. You can go and stand in some of the meadows that we put in now, and on a hot summer's day, they just buzz. Quite a lot of honeybees, but there's all sorts of other things too. And it really, it's almost therapeutic going and standing in them. It's my wife and I'll both go, and we absolutely love it. The hay they provides crap, but that doesn't really matter too much.
Wonderful, absolutely wonderful, and that's what this event is all about. Is trying to achieve those sort of outcomes that just give you that enormous sense of well-being.
Yeah.
As well as just being the right thing to do for our environment and for our biodiversity. It's wonderful. So thank you for sharing.
One more thing I should probably say, because again, this is organised by, like I said, Richmondshire Climate Action Group. I realise it's climate and ecological festival, but I think, you know, in terms of we talked about tree planting, we talked about the carbon sequestration. It's really important to realise the importance that well-managed grasslands, the important role they have to play in storing carbon. Well-managed grasslands store carbon year after year after year. You know, it's permanently burying it, well, subject to us wrecking it, it's permanently burying it down in the soil. Tree planting is fantastic. It's really important in the right places. You know, that carbon locked up, tree falls, not locked up. Soil, it's consistently getting locked in, soils and peat bogs. So there's a huge role in Swaledale for carbon storage. And tree planting in the right places will inevitably be a part of that. I think that and nectar regeneration should play a part, because you know, the landscape here did have trees in the right places. When you say that, people get outraged because they think of they either think of peat bogs or they think of floodplain meadows or whatever it might be. But trees have a place here, and it all adds up for a you know, nice patchwork of opportunities for biodiversity and carbon storage. It's just about getting people. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on winning hearts and minds for the climate argument, but I think it's about linking these things up and, you know, showing what it could be like.
No, well, I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's both. So we are now an hour and a half into this, and I think we've taken a lot of your time, Jamie. So thank you very much for that, and I very much thank everyone that's joined us for sticking with us for an hour and a half. If there are any absolutely burning questions, we'll take those just before we close, but otherwise I think it's probably getting towards an appropriate moment to close. So I'll just ask anyone who's got a burning question, stick their hand up quickly and we'll try and deal with that. Otherwise, we'll say our thanks.
If not, if you send an email to the general Buglife address and ask for it to go to Jamie, there are no other Jamies at Buglife, so it'll find its way to me anyway.
Fabulous. Well, I don't see any other hands, but let me take this opportunity, Jamie, once again to say thank you very much for sharing your expertise and your experience and giving us a really informative and great fun talk.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.